Welcome to the global comedy of errors where the US plays the lead role, where we dissect the news with the precision of a brain surgeon and the subtlety of a runaway train. This week's topic, America's self-proclaimed role as the world's human rights champion. Now, I know what you're thinking. John, that sounds awfully noble. Surely you're not about to rain on that parade, are you? Oh, you bet your sweet star-spangled ass I am. Because let's face it, America's relationship with human rights is a bit like its relationship with healthy eating. All talk and no action. We're quick to point out the nutritional deficiencies in everyone else's diets, while we're over here, mainlining cheeseburgers and supersized sodas. We love to lecture countries like Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela about their human rights records. And don't get me wrong, those records are about as pretty as a dumpster fire in a sewage plant. But America's holier-than-thou attitude wouldn't be quite so galling if we weren't simultaneously giving free passes to some seriously dodgy regimes. It's like we've got this weird mental block where we can only acknowledge human rights abuses when they are committed by people we don't like very much. According to the US State Department, over 100 countries were cited for human rights abuses in 2020 alone. Yet, the US continues to sell billions of dollars in arms to countries with abysmal human rights records like Saudi Arabia and Egypt. In fact, a 2019 report found that 73% of US arms sales went to countries that were listed as not free by Freedom House. And let's not forget America's own history of interventions and military operations that have often exacerbated human rights issues. From Guantanamo Bay to the CIA's use of torture, the US has its own skeletons in the closet. So, before we get too comfortable on our high horse, maybe it's time to take a long, hard look in the mirror. Let's start with the usual suspects, shall we? Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, the unholy trinity of human rights violators, according to the good old US of A. Now, I'm not here to defend their actions. These regimes are about as democratic as a pack of wolves deciding who gets to eat the slowest gazelle. They suppress dissent. They imprison activists. They make life generally miserable for anyone who dares to question their authority. For instance, in Iran, over 7,000 protesters were arrested during the 2019 to 2020 protests. But here's the thing. America's outrage over these abuses often feels performative, like we're more interested in scoring political points than actually making a difference. In 2020, the US issued over 1,500 sanctions, many targeting these nations. We slap sanctions on them, we issue strongly worded condemnations, we generally make a lot of noise about how awful they are. Yet, these sanctions often hurt the civilian population more than the regimes. But then we turn a blind eye to the human rights abuses committed by our allies. You know, the ones who buy our weapons and let us park our aircraft carriers in their harbors. For example, Saudi Arabia, a major US ally, has been criticized for its human rights record, including the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi and the ongoing war in Yemen. Take Saudi Arabia, for example. Now, I'm no expert in international relations, but I'm pretty sure that publicly dismembering journalists like Jamal Khashoggi in 2018 and waging a brutal war in Yemen that's created one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world, with over 233,000 deaths, doesn't exactly scream human rights champion. Yet, we continue to sell them weapons. Totaling over $100 billion in arms sales since 2010, we continue to support their government, and we continue to pretend that their money doesn't smell faintly of, well, blood. It's like we've got this weird moral calculus where human rights abuses are perfectly acceptable, as long as they're committed by a country that can provide us with a steady supply of cheap oil, accounting for 11% of the world's oil production. And then there's Egypt, a country that's received over $50 billion in US aid since 1979. Now, you might think that all that money would come with a few strings attached, like, you know, maybe not torturing political prisoners or disappearing dissidents. But apparently, you'd be wrong. According to Human Rights Watch, thousands of political prisoners remain behind bars. Because Egypt's human rights record is about as abysmal as its traffic, with reports of enforced disappearances and extrajudicial killings. And yet, the US continues to shower them with money, like a drunken uncle at a wedding. In 2020 alone, Egypt received $1.3 billion in military aid. It's enough to make you wonder if anyone in the State Department has even bothered to crack open a human rights report lately. The Freedom House rates Egypt as not free, scoring just 18 out of 100 in global freedom rankings. Pause 3S. And speaking of complex relationships, let's take a closer look at the endless cycle of conflict and aid between Israel and Gaza. The year 2024 has been particularly devastating, with renewed hostilities leading to even more loss of life and destruction. According to the latest reports, over 1,200 Palestinians and 150 Israelis have been killed in the latest round of violence. The Gaza Strip remains under a blockade that has now lasted for 17 years, creating a dire humanitarian situation for its 2 million residents. The US continues to provide substantial military aid to Israel, with the total amount now exceeding $150 billion since World War II. Just this year, another $3.8 billion was allocated, reinforcing the military support that many argue fuels the ongoing conflict. Meanwhile, the international community watches as the cycle of violence repeats, with little hope for a lasting peace. The situation in Gaza is nothing short of catastrophic. Hospitals are overwhelmed, and basic necessities like clean water and electricity are in short supply. The United Nations has repeatedly called for an end to the blockade, but the pleas seem to fall on deaf ears. With each passing year, the dream of a two-state solution fades further into the distance, replaced by a grim reality where violence begets more violence, and aid becomes a band-aid on a gaping wound. Pause 3S. As we ponder these grim statistics, it's worth asking ourselves, is our continued financial support truly fostering peace, or are we merely perpetuating a cycle of suffering and despair? Section 5. Israel, a complex relationship built on shared values and ignoring some others. And then, of course, there's Israel, America's BFF in the Middle East. The US has provided Israel with over $146 billion in aid since World War II. Now look, I know this is a complicated issue, but let's not pretend that Israel's treatment of Palestinians in the occupied territories is anything other than a human rights disaster. According to the United Nations, over 5,000 Palestinians have been killed in conflict since 2008. The settlements, the checkpoints, the blockade of Gaza, it's a system that's designed to keep Palestinians marginalized and powerless. There are over 600,000 Israeli settlers living in the West Bank and East Jerusalem in violation of international law. And yet, the US continues to provide Israel with billions of dollars in military aid every year, effectively giving them a blank check to continue their occupation. In 2016, the US signed a $38 billion military aid package for Israel over 10 years. It's like we're so busy defending Israel's right to exist that we've forgotten about the Palestinians' right to, also exist. The Gaza Strip has been under blockade since 2007, leading to severe humanitarian crises for its 2 million residents. Section 6, America's Greatest Hits, a history of human rights mishaps. But hey, let's not pretend that America's got a spotless record when it comes to human rights, because that would be like saying that Donald Trump's hair is a natural phenomenon. From our treatment of Native Americans, where an estimated 90% of the population was decimated due to disease, warfare, and displacement, to our history of slavery, which saw over 12 million Africans forcibly transported to the Americas, and segregation, which legally enforced racial discrimination until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, America's got its fair share of skeletons in the closet. And let's not forget our more recent greatest hits, like the Iraq War, which was based on, shall we say, some creative interpretations of intelligence. The conflict resulted in over 200,000 civilian deaths and displaced millions. Or how about our little adventure in rendition, where we kidnapped suspected terrorists and shipped them off to secret prisons around the world to be tortured? Reports indicate that at least 119 individuals were subjected to this program, many of whom were later found to be innocent. It's enough to make you wonder if we've learned anything from our history of human rights abuses. Despite these dark chapters, awareness and advocacy continue to grow, reminding us of the importance of vigilance and accountability. Section 7. Guantanamo Bay, Fun in the Sun, and Torture. Speaking of torture, let's talk about Guantanamo Bay, shall we? That little slice of paradise in Cuba where we've been holding suspected terrorists without trial for over 2 decades. Because nothing says due process like indefinite detention and waterboarding. Since its opening in 2002, over 780 detainees have been held at Guantanamo Bay. As of 2021, 39 detainees remain. It's enough to make you wonder if the Founding Fathers ever envisioned a day when America would be running its own offshore torture camp. The United Nations and various human rights organizations have repeatedly condemned the facility, calling for its closure and the end of torture practices. Section 8. drone strikes, precision bombing, questionable morality. And then there's our love affair with drone strikes, which we seem to think are the perfect solution to, well, everything. Need to take out a terrorist leader in Pakistan? According to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, US drone strikes in Pakistan have killed between 424 and 969 civilians since 2004. Drone strike. Want to eliminate a suspected insurgent in Yemen? In Yemen, drone strikes have resulted in the deaths of at least 174 civilians, including women and children. Drone strike. Feeling peckish and fancy a spot of extrajudicial killing? The United Nations has repeatedly condemned these strikes as violations of international law. Drone strike. Look, I get it. Drones are cool. They're like the Roomba of warfare. Efficient, impersonal, and slightly terrifying. But they're also incredibly problematic, especially when they result in civilian casualties. A study by Stanford and NYU found that only 2% of drone strike victims in Pakistan were high-profile targets. But hey, who needs a trial when you've got a joystick and a Hellfire missile, right? Section 9. The price of hypocrisy. Why America's credibility is tanking. So, where does all this leave us? Well, for starters, it makes America look like a hypocrite. We're quick to condemn human rights abuses when it's politically expedient, but we turn a blind eye to them when they're committed by our allies. For example, the US has often criticized countries like China and Russia for their human rights records, while maintaining close ties with nations like Saudi Arabia despite its poor human rights record. This double standard is evident in the fact that the US provides billions in military aid to countries with questionable human rights practices. Because when we preach human rights but don't practice them, we lose credibility. We become the preachy parent who tells their kids not to smoke while sneaking a cigarette out the window. According to a 2020 report, the US provided over $3.8 billion in military aid to Egypt despite its ongoing human rights abuses. And nobody likes a hypocrite, least of all the rest of the world. Section 10. A call for consistency. Can America walk the walk, not just talk the talk? So, what's the solution? Well, it's not rocket science. According to Human Rights Watch, the US has been criticized for its own human rights record, including issues like mass incarceration and police brutality. If America wants to be taken seriously as a defender of human rights, we need to start practicing what we preach. The US spends over $700 billion annually on its military, yet struggles to address systemic issues at home. We need to hold all human rights abusers accountable, regardless of their strategic importance or the size of their bank accounts. For instance, Saudi Arabia, a key US ally, has a troubling human rights record. We need to stop using human rights as a cudgel to beat our enemies with while ignoring the abuses of our friends. In short, we need to get our own house in order before we start lecturing everyone else about theirs. Because until we do, America's claim to be a beacon of human rights will continue to ring as hollow as a politician's promise. A 2020 report by Amnesty International highlighted the US's failure to address racial inequality and police violence. That's our show for tonight, folks. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more content.